Hi, my name is Ilana Walder-Bizance. I'm a former Yahoo PM, and in this Exponent Expert video, I'll be answering the Facebook PM interview question. If you were a PM for Instagram stories considering extending the expiration time on stories, what metrics would you use to make your decision? So the first thing I'm going to do here is admit candidly that I'm not a very regular Instagram user and ask for a little more background on stories and how they work. Now, I did look this up for the sake of this question, so we'll assume that the interviewer has explained that stories are a feature in Instagram where people upload content that is combined into a story that lasts for 24 hours. That friends and others visiting their Instagram profile can view. And so with that knowledge and knowing that it's 24 hours, my next question is what length are we considering extending this expiration time to? And I'm going to assume that we're considering doubling it to 48 hours, 2 full days. My next question would be, are stories shown differently to different users viewing them, or depending on the users they're coming from? For instance, are stories different for a user's friends versus random people on Instagram who encounter their profile? And similarly, are stories different for, say, business Instagram accounts versus individual user Instagram accounts? And I'm going to assume that I've been told they operate the same way for all of these contexts, and also that we're considering making this same change across all of these contexts. And that's just to simplify things. And next, I'm wondering what the motivation for considering this change is. What is the goal of potentially lengthening the expiration time? And I'm going to assume my interviewer tells me to come up with some potential goals for that. And so I'm going to think about why might we want to do this. One possibility is that we're trying to shift focus in the product away from sort of the feed and more into stories, as those are kind of different views. And maybe, for instance, ad revenue is better in stories than in the feed. And so we'd like to shift the proportion of time that's spent in the product more towards stories. Another possibility is that we're encountering people navigating to stories a lot and finding them empty. And we want to reduce the incidence of empty stories because we think that's a really bad user experience. Another possibility is that by leaving content in stories longer, we increase the total length of stories, and that leads to overall increased engagement, both with stories and in the app overall. So those are 3 possibilities I can think of. Each of those would mean we were measuring a different thing, but we'll get to that in a second. So let's talk about what metrics we use to evaluate this change. And the first framing I want to put here is that this is absolutely going to be an A/B test. I'm not going to look at current metrics from the app and then make a decision without testing it out, because nothing we know about how users behave in the app right now is going to give us a clear and definitive answer about how making this change would change their behavior. So we're definitely going to want to A/B test the extended expiration time. And when I A/B test features, I tend to have 2 categories of metrics that I look at. One are the metrics that are specific to this test. And those are the metrics that I want to improve. And if this test does not improve those metrics, then we shouldn't launch it. Essentially, for instance, maybe my hypothesis is this decreases the percentage of clicks on stories that yield people opening empty stories. So my metric for the test would indeed be that percentage, and I'd be testing to see whether it went down. Now, there's a second category of metrics that are sort of universal guardrail metrics. And these are metrics that I keep track of with every single A/B test because they're key to the functioning of the app and the business. And any individual test doesn't necessarily have to make them better, but it's not allowed to make them worse. Or at least it's not allowed to make them more than a certain very small amount worse. So I'm going to come up with potential metrics in both of those buckets. I think I'll actually start with the guardrail metrics because those are pretty straightforward. Now, probably I would already have these defined before I even thought of this particular feature change because those are going to be the same for every A/B test. But because I'm doing this from scratch, I'll come up with them now for this test. So I definitely want, the way I'm thinking about it here is that there's kind of a funnel. There's getting users in the door, there's keeping those users, there's getting them to spend more time on the app, and then there's monetizing those users. And my guardrail metrics are probably going to reflect that funnel. I'm going to put getting users in the door aside now because a small detail like this isn't going to drive things like installs in any super noticeable way. But I think I'll have a guardrail metric around each of those other things. So one is keeping users that we get in the door. We're going to want a guardrail metric around retention. We probably have a standard length of retention that we look at, 3 days, 7 days, a month. I tend to like 7-day retention. It's long enough that people who aren't addicted to their phones will probably still come back within 7 days, but short enough that we're seeing that they're relatively active users. So my first guardrail metric there is going to be 7-day retention. That can't go down. My second guardrail metric is around engagement. And so this is just going to be amount of time per user spent in the app. Maybe this is something we're also hoping that this change will improve, but maybe this change is focused on something else. I had a couple different hypotheses for what it could be focused on. Regardless though, we don't want that to go down. And then the third is around monetization. We don't want revenue per user to go down with pretty much any change that we're making. So we'll probably always want to be keeping an eye on that. So those are my 3 guardrail metrics. And now the question is, what are my metrics to actually evaluate this change? And again, this goes back to what the goal of this change was. I posited one that perhaps it's to have fewer empty stories. That's something we could easily measure. There are other potential goals of this change also, as we talked about. Perhaps we are trying to drive more time spent in the app, in which case that will be the metric I'm tracking for this change rather than merely a guardrail metric, and I'll want it not just to stay even, but to go up. What else could it be? Maybe I want to increase the number of views per story, but it doesn't seem like this would drive that. So I'm gonna put that aside for now. Maybe I want to increase engagement with stories. It does seem like increasing the amount of content in them and the time that it stays up could contribute well to that. And engagement with stories could be liking them, or it could be resharing them. So perhaps I want to increase the total number of reshares and likes on stories. That seems like a good candidate. What else could it be? It could be, so we talked earlier about shifting focus from the feed to the stories. So perhaps I want to increase the total time spent, not just in the Instagram app, but the time spent in stories in particular. And perhaps I even want to increase the number of stories that people are creating. Now, which of these matter most depends on what my goal for the feature was, but I'm not going to track them all and insist that they all go up, because that's a recipe for a disaster with an A/B test. I'm going to probably pick at most 2 metrics that my hypothesis is that this change will drive those in the direction that I want them to go. And given that I don't have other context about the reason behind this change, the 2 that make the most sense to me are the amount of time users spend on average, specifically within stories, and the number of engagements, combined likes and reshares, that users have on average with stories. So when I A/B test this feature, I'm going to be looking for those two metrics to go up, or at least one to go up and one to stay steady. And then I'm also going to be looking for the 3 guardrail metrics that I mentioned earlier around retention, overall engagement, and monetization to at least stay steady. And if all of those things turn out to be true in the A/B test, then I think that would be a pretty good indicator that this feature is a strong candidate to launch to users as a whole.